So as of filming this, we're about a quarter of the way through 2023, but just within the past 3 months alone, over 400 anti-LGBTQ bills have been introduced in the US, an overwhelming amount of which targeting the trans community. These bills include anything from limiting to outright banning gender-affirming care for children, banning social transitioning in forms of drag and cross-dressing, to forcibly detransitioning trans people that are already well into adulthood. As you can imagine, this vilification of queer and trans identities has given a rise of hate crimes committed against the LGBT+ community, from stochastic terrorism in forms of bomb threats made against clinics and medical facilities supporting trans identity like the Boston Children's Hospital, to destroying safe spaces for queer people like the Club Q shooting, taking the lives of 5 individuals and injuring many others, down to attacking individual trans people like 16-year-old Brianna Jai, who was stabbed to death just for taking a walk in the park. While the US is facing the brunt of this attack against trans people, countries like the UK is no far behind, with Australia and New Zealand just having experienced the rally held by anti-trans British activist Kellie J. Keane Minshall, also known as her alias Posy Parker, so it's becoming a worldwide thing if it hasn't already. I have been reluctant to refer to this as the trans genocide, as many activists already have, not just because comparing things with anti-Semitism, Holocaust, and Nazi Germany is pretty overdone, especially on the internet, but also I wanted to be respectful and sensitive to the Jewish community because anti-Semitic attacks are also on the rise thanks to a certain celebrity.
Can we just kind of say, like, you like the uniforms, but that's about it?
No, there's a lot of things that I love about Hitler. A lot of things.
But reading through the 10 stages of genocide, seeing similarities between the language used against Jewish people leading up to the Holocaust.
This is their own views, their own opinions. I mean, this is what they stand for. And I'm just showing people, and they run away the last bit because they don't like it.
You're turning the lights on. And
exactly. They're like cockroaches running away in the light.
Really hit me as to how dire the situation has gotten. We are already at stage 7, where lawmakers and public figures are actively calling for the extermination of trans identity.
Transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely. The whole preposterous ideology at every level.
Here's my plan to stop the chemical, physical, and emotional mutilation of our youth. On day 1, I will revoke Joe Biden's cruel policies on so-called gender-affirming care. Ridiculous. A process that includes giving kids puberty blockers, mutating their physical appearance, and ultimately performing surgery on minor children.
I think these doctors need to get sued for what's happening. I'm sorry.
All of these bills and laws foster an environment where being trans is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, through limiting or banning access to gender-affirming care, limiting sex education, and generally making it unsafe for you to simply exist as a trans person. Within the last year alone, more than 50% of trans and non-binary youth have considered taking their lives. Hundreds and thousands of queer and trans people are forced to move, to relocate from their homes where they have grown up in, because it is simply too dangerous for them to continue living there.
Hi, my name is Sam, and I am a transgender person in the state of Tennessee. The date is March 7th, 2023. As of now, Tennessee has made it illegal for drag performers to perform, as well as people to cross-dress in public. They have signed, and it will be going into action, a complete ban on gender-reaffirming care, life-saving care for transgender youth. I've put up a long fight, a hard fight, and I will continue to fight, but I need to leave. It's not safe. I need to leave. The United States is a sinking ship, and I will continue to fight for those who can't leave, but I need to leave.
So even though we're not at the stage yet where we're throwing trans people into concentration camps, the way things are headed, we're really not that far off. In the midst of this grave tragedy, the extinction, extermination, eradication of trans identity, you would at the very least expect the LGBT plus community to have trans people's back, right? You would expect the community to come together during hard times, be there for each other, and provide a space where trans and non-binary people could feel safe and accepted. Right?
Recently, there is a group called the LGB Alliance who are said to be distancing themselves from trans activism, and I can understand why.
There are members of the LGBTQ community who are speaking out about transitioning children at a young age.
They are basically using an entire generation of children as lab rats for this sick ideology.
There's nothing mainstream about putting drugs into healthy children before they can consent to anything else in this world.
How are you a they? What the fuck does that mean? It's stupid is what it is.
Yeah.
And this is why we can't have nice things. So, the LGB Alliance is a British organization that claims to promote the rights of lesbians, bisexuals, and gay men, but ever since its inception, it has worked to dismiss and erode trans rights through defending transphobic activists, anti-trans bills and legislations. In the US, there is the Gays Against Groomers, founded by Jamie Michel, and if by this point, for those that are unaware, by groomers they mean trans people, tags like LGB without the T almost always trends on Twitter. The whole gist of all these movements, if you can't tell already, is to divide up the LGBT plus community. As the trans community has become like the boogeyman for everything, the scapegoat for everything that is wrong with society, some members of the LGBT plus community decided, hey, we don't want to associate ourselves with trans people anymore. Instead of coming together during these hard times, we're going to leave and form our own group without trans people, not just because it is way easier to punch down than it is to punch up, but you know, we are the good gays. We don't stand by this 76 genders pronouns nonsense. We are the gays that are against groomers. It's the whole pick-me shtick, but with the LGBT plus community, and if you have made it to this point without knowing what a pick-me is, according to Urban Dictionary, a pick-me is a woman that is willing to do anything for male approval. She will embarrass or throw other women under the bus to achieve this goal. The term originates from Black Twitter, from AAVE, just like most slang that is used today in everyday life, and was used to originally refer to women that will denounce feminism, distance themselves from other women just for male validation and approval. Obviously, in the case of the LGBT plus community, they are choosing to jump on the bandwagon of hating trans people, throwing trans and non-binary people under the bus just to pander and appeal to conservatives, Republicans, or just homophobes in general. But even outside of the political sphere, it is not difficult to find queer people that are, although queer, have no problem displaying bigotry towards other minority groups. One of the biggest problems that is present in the LGBT plus community that I personally hear constantly about is the racism and classism. Just a couple of years ago, openly gay and bisexual men like Jeffree Star and Shane Dawson were literally getting cancelled for blatant racism. And this has always oddly fascinated me because as an openly queer person, you would expect these people out of everyone else to have empathy, right? As a member of a marginalized group, you would know what it's like to be discriminated against, what it's like for people to dismiss and invalidate your identity. Then how come you are not only unable to extend that same empathy and understanding, but actively perpetuate in the same hatred as their oppressor towards not only people of other communities like people of color, but within your own community as well, like non-binary people?
I'm not into all the other bullshit. I think
what other bullshit?
The they and them.
Yeah.
And all that extra shit that we added during the pandemic because everyone was so bored on their fucking houses. They just started to make up more shit and more shit.
More stuff.
Yeah.
Vibe
Not they
to
and
you.
them. You're trans, you're male or you're female.
And you're standing on that.
Get so mad when I say that. How are you a they? What the fuck does that mean? It's stupid is what it is.
Yeah.
Well, one of the reasons is actually pretty simple: money. Being a mouthpiece for the conservatives is an easy way to make money both on YouTube and in the real world, especially if it's coming from somebody from a minority group like women, people of color, LGBT+ community. Black community especially is full of pygmies, sellouts, grifters, Uncle Toms, Uncle Ruckus, and all sorts of uncles and aunties that have no problem throwing their community under the bus for a quick buck by pandering to racists. Candace Owens is one of the loudest voices in this area, who is sometimes referred to as the black conservative. She went from being racially targeted to the point she needed to seek help from NAACP to claiming that white supremacy and racism is not a real issue and the black community just needs to pick themselves up by the bootstraps.
You know that white supremacy and white nationalism ranks nowhere near the top of the issues that are facing Black America.
In the LGBT+ community, we have Dave Rubin from the channel The Rubin Report. With nearly 2 million subscribers, he is undoubtedly one of the loudest voices of the queer conservative side of YouTube. Being both queer and conservative may sound like an oxymoron, but Dave, as an openly gay man, is here to prove us wrong. Dave claims to be a centrist, a classical liberal, whatever that even means, but that doesn't negate the fact that he constantly aligns himself with far-right, conservative, fundamentalist figures like Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, down to open white nationalists like Stefan Molyneux and Lawrence Southern. Dave's stance and who he chooses to align himself with may seem counterproductive to his identity, but it's important to note that people who are cis, white, and male, like Dave, still hold an enormous amount of privilege in this society that grants them access to capital. And this may sound sociopathic, but in our hyper-individualist society, once somebody is doing well for themselves, it is unlikely for them to think of others, let alone those that are beneath them, especially if the grift is bringing them enough money to be able to afford to live in a mansion. Even though it is thanks to their hard work and their activism that allowed us to have the progress that we have today, that allowed someone like Dave Rubin to have the platform that he does despite his sexuality. Pride was literally started by a black trans woman named Marsha P. Johnson in the late 60s, yet fast forward to today, here is Dave biting the hand that fed him by associating himself with openly anti-trans pundits and people that think black people have smaller brains than white people.
I mean, if we took the brain of a 25-year-old black man and the brain of a 25-year-old white man, what is it that they're doing that...
different sizes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other reason why queer people may lean into conservatism is the internalized hatred that they might have towards themselves. And there is no better person to talk about internalized hatred than Blair White. You seriously thought I could make a video about pygmy queers without mentioning Blair White? For those who don't know, Blair White is a trans political commentator with over 1 million subscribers on YouTube whose whole shtick is just, I'm not like other trans girls, I like guns and Trump, and I hate other trans people and trans people hate me because I speak the truth. And also, if you see a bulge in a conservative woman's pants, it's a gun. If you see a bulge in a liberal woman's pants, it's a penis. Ah! Blair, get a new joke! No, seriously, she has tweeted the exact same thing about a year ago, word for word. But despite all that, I find Blair to be very interesting because beneath this persona, this I don't care if I'm problematic, this whole bad bitch attitude that she tries to put on, it's pretty obvious that deep down she is actually super insecure, and I would even go as far as to say that she probably hates herself. You can see by the thumbnails of her videos alone, it's more about attacking the other person, making them look bad rather than discussing as to why they're wrong. In every video where she targets a trans or a non-binary person, she dichotomizes by choosing an unflattering still image of them, whereas she is the pretty one. She is the good trans person that is sick of all these crazy people making her look bad.
I feel like I'm always damage controlling for the trans community, which is so frustrating.
Blair's primary target seems to be queer people that she finds to be weird, and by weird I mean people that look different to her, and also trans people that do not strictly pass. So much so to the point she would even deceptively manipulate their photos at times, like in this video where she photoshopped a beard on this trans woman's face for the thumbnail, even though she later on shows in the actual video that she doesn't have any facial hair. But the worst thing that she has done in this regard, in my opinion, was when she reacted to this trans powerlifter by the name of Janae Marie Kroc. In the thumbnail, she showed a video of Janae pre-transition, which showing pre-transition photos of a trans person is already a pretty shitty thing to do. But it wasn't just any photo that she had chosen, but the photo in which Janae was undergoing chemo due to her cancer treatment, which caused her hair to fall off and thus making her seem less feminine. Thankfully, she did delete the video after receiving some backlash, but my point still stands. No person that is genuinely happy with themselves, are confident in themselves, would go to such extent to make somebody else look bad, let alone a former cancer patient that has done nothing to Blair. Despite this I don't give a fuck what people think of me, I'll say what I want persona that Blair tries to put on, it's painfully obvious that she does care quite a bit of what others think of her, except the people that she tries to pander and appeal to simply do not want people like her to even exist, yet she would literally sit there being absolutely spineless as they would dismiss and invalidate her identity or downright insult her.
You're a very feminine biological man, and you've had the surgeries to prove it, then I think that we can talk about.
Trigger warnings used to be on TV for seizures, and now they're everywhere to protect millennials' feelings. He, she, his, him, hers, them, they, screw a pronoun, cause everyone's a retard these days.
We also have a transgender on here. I don't really think we should be giving a platform to this kind of degeneracy, which is a gateway drug to pedophilia.
Yet Blair would continue to pander to them by saying things like, oh no, I'm not like any of those crazy trans people that wants kids transitioning. I'm a good trans person. I am against kids transitioning.
I don't really know how much you know about me, but I'm probably the most vocal anti-children transitioning person on the internet. It's what I'm.
Right.
I'll let you speak.
The best thing you can do for us is grow out your mustache and tell people not to live like you. That is the best thing that you can do to help us.
But isn't one of the biggest things that Blair goes on about is how trans people need to look the part and pass as their chosen gender to be taken seriously?
And I agree with you also. You've mentioned that if someone makes no effort to transition at all, it's really unreasonable to expect that someone actually uses pronouns in a way that they prefer, because
the later in life you transition, especially if you have already gone through puberty, the harder it becomes to pass. Also, how young is too young to transition? Because according to this bill in Oklahoma, being under 26 is now seen as too young to transition. Blair started transitioning when she was 22. Isn't that too young according to the standards that we have now? Ultimately, a lot of what Blair embodies is defined in sociology as respectability politics, trans edition. According to dictionary.com, respectability politics is defined as a set of beliefs holding that conformity to prescribed mainstream standards of appearance and behavior will protect a person who is part of a marginalized group, like a black person, from prejudices and systemic injustices. This paper on black conservatism, I think, draws some interesting parallels, as it says at one point, support for the protest and work ethic is also a tenet of black conservatives. Often referred to as the founding father of black conservatism, Jupiter Hammond was a Long Island slave and a literary figure. His literary work emphasized the importance of respectability, humility, morality, Christianity, and deference towards authority. During Hammond's time, black conservatives believed that free blacks had a responsibility to set examples for others by upholding high moral standards. This included proving themselves worthy of freedom by avoiding stealing and being lazy, as well as behaving in a manner to dispel myths about blacks being incapable of living a directed life. Now, just replace black people with trans people from everything I've just said, and you have Blair White in a nutshell. But pretty much, trans people like Blair that uphold respectability politics believe that if you look the part, i.e. passing, keep a low profile, aka not being like those crazy trans people with colored hair, and uphold the status quo by being one of the good ones, you would be protected from injustices and discrimination. And while I sympathize with this viewpoint, I think there are definitely instances where it is necessary to play into respectability politics. Say if you are a closeted queer person stuck in a conservative town in the middle of nowhere, constantly dealing with hostility and microaggressions, being too out there and flamboyant about your queerness can be dangerous and put your safety at risk. So I understand wanting to keep a low profile in such cases in order to not draw too much attention to yourself. But the issue arises when you insist that that is the only way to be trans. That is how every trans person should be living, as from her videos, it's pretty obvious that Blair is intolerant of any trans person whose trans experience is different to hers. Not to mention, not every trans person can afford to medically transition, and many don't want to. Having access to hormones, surgeries, therapies, makeup, hair treatment is a huge privilege that Blair never seems to acknowledge. But ultimately, does it work? Does playing into mainstream conformity and going out of your way to pander to transphobes by being one of the good ones protect people like Blair from harassment and injustice? I have been comparing the oppression of black people and trans people throughout this video because I think there are a lot of similarities and parallels to be made, but going back to black conservatives like Candace Owens, Thomas Sowell, Larry Elder, and many others on how they believe that black community's problem is themselves and all they need to do is pull themselves up by the bootstraps of racism, well, the problem with that is, throughout history, black people have been doing that, but every time they manage to catch up or get ahead even to the slightest bit, they get burned down and destroyed through race riots and massacre. Tulsa is the most popular one that comes to mind, where in the 1920s, the black community came together and built a flourishing neighborhood that was literally known as the Black Wall Street, with property that would be worth millions today, only for them to get hit with a race riot and have more than 35 blocks of the neighborhood destroyed. There are hundreds of more race riots that goes to show that systemic injustices will always overrule the progress individuals can make. Similarly, we've seen through the interactions that Blair has that it literally doesn't matter how well you pass, how much you try to separate yourself from the trans community, the very people you're trying to seek validation from would see you as a groomer and a pedophile no matter what. About a year ago, Dave Rubin faced a significant amount of backlash from his own community when he announced on Twitter that he and his husband were expecting children through surrogacy. It was a classic leopards ate your face moment, as some of the comments that they received were disgusting to say the least. You know, it's the typical homophobic talking point. Think of the children. Every child needs a mother and a father. This is child abuse. They're gonna grow up having two dads. They're gonna get so confused. No. If anything, I reckon they would get far more confused as to why their dad hangs around with people that wants him to repent for simply existing. And it was painful to watch Dave sit through all of this and be an absolute doormat, not even being able to stand up for his family.
A family generally is a father and a mother and then children. Are there ways? That is the norm. That is the norm, and I would say in some ways this is going to sound a little bit weird for a certain amount of people, but that is sort of the ideal. But in the world, not everything is always the ideal. Make something good happen.
What I hear from your things right now is that on the ideal, you would prefer that your children will be heterosexual, and to live in the classic ideal family, men and women.
Well, I wouldn't prefer, well, that's not exactly what I'm saying. I don't know that I would prefer that they would be. I would prefer that I am able to raise two children who are functional adults who have an understanding of the way the world works and can find some meaning in their lives and live a life that's important to them. If ultimately they both turn out to be straight, that's fantastic. If one of them turns out to be gay, that's fine too.
But like, are you really surprised at this though? Are you really?
Well, imagine my shock.
Even outside of YouTube, in the US there is this organization called Log Cabin Republicans that consists of mostly cis white gay men that are, although gay, choose to vote and support the Republican Party. Their justification for this is pretty much everything that I've been talking about thus far, mostly respectability politics of, oh, we're not like those crazy degenerate gays, we're the gays that voted for Trump. But with the current climate of the moral panic against the LGBT, the constant vilification of anything queer, especially in states like Texas that have put out dozens of anti-LGBT bills, the log cabin Republicans were pretty much ousted from the party, and it shocked Pikachus everywhere. But what's important to note is that it's not necessarily the homophobia that they were surprised by, because that is something that is to be expected from the Republican Party, but rather the fact that they were ousted from the party that holds a majority of the political power. And like I said before, being white, cis, and male still grants you a lot of power and privilege in this society, and they thought their status as those things can keep them protected and let them have some power, but it doesn't work like that. Especially when one of the main ways fascism works is by narrowing down further and further as to who can and can't be in positions of power. I think one of the best ways to explain how fascism works is through exploring the concept of whiteness. You know, on the internet, in the social justice circles especially, we hear all the time about all this white people, all the memes about how white people have no culture, but what even is whiteness? This may sound like a silly question, but when you start peeling back layers, it gets even more confusing. Your first instinct maybe is to say, well, it's people that are light-skinned, that have less melanin content in their skin tone, the features of pale skin, blonde hair, blue eyes. But there are plenty of people with those features from every other race that are not considered to be white. There are East Asian people that have fair complexions. In Middle Eastern countries like Iran, Persia, and Turkey, there are plenty of people that have all those features, yet they're not considered to be white. Hell, there are African people even that have some, if not all of those features. Then you might say, well, no, you have to have those features and be from a Western country to be considered white. But the concept of West has always confused me, because when people say West, they do not mean geographically the West. Like, you are telling me that the entire continent of South America, even though it's in the West, is still not considered to be a part of it? I mean, Mexico is literally attached to the US, separated by a mere border, yet is not considered West, even though US is? And also, what about countries like Australia and New Zealand that are not even in the West, but are considered to be a part of it? Then you might say, well, no, it's not the West, but only a selected few countries like Western Europe that is considered to be white. But then again, surprise, we have another problem. Because throughout history, even within Europe, it has always changed and shifted as to what countries can or cannot claim their white identity. A notable example is Irish, who were once considered to be too degenerate to be white due to their supposed laziness, lack of discipline, drinking habits, and Catholic origin. A similar treatment was received by Italians, Jews, and even Germans, who were once not seen as white. As Benjamin Franklin, one of America's founding fathers, once wrote in response to German immigration to colonies, since detachments of English from Britain sent to America will have their places at home so soon, supply would and increase so largely here, why should the Palatine Boers, Germans, be suffered to swarm into our settlements and by herding together establish their language and manners to the exclusion of ours? Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our Anglifying them, and will never adopt our language or customs any more than they can acquire our complexion? This is Germans that he is talking about. Even Germans were not considered to be white at one point, which is pretty ironic when you really think about it. But I hope you're getting the gist of what I'm trying to say. No other race in history has gatekept to this extent as to who can or cannot belong to that race. It's because whiteness is not actually a real thing. It is an abstract concept of purity that gets narrower and narrower the more fascist a government becomes. The sole reason for whiteness to exist is to be anti-black. It's more about what you are not versus what you are. Hence, people say white people have no culture. Hence, when you have people that are mixed, like Barack Obama, who has one white parent and one black parent, he is still known as the first black president. So, with all of this in mind, let's talk about LGB Alliance. The LGB Alliance started off obviously in response to the trans movement to drive a wedge between the trans and the rest of the queer community, but ever since its inception, they have been openly hostile to their bisexual members. This is not just directed at the LGB Alliance specifically, but towards any trans exclusionary movements, to the point there is an entire account dedicated to tracking down every biphobic and queerphobic statements that they have put out. Most of it is typical biphobic stuff, erasing bisexuality, claiming that bisexuals are doing it for attention, saying the quiet part out loud at times, not even trying to conceal their hate. So at some point, to nobody's surprise, they decided to get rid of bisexuals in their own special little club separate from everybody else. So I guess it went from LGB to just LG. But then it gets worse because eventually the gays decided to leave as well. The article that they have linked to explain their reasoning behind this is that the discrimination and injustices faced by lesbians is different to the ones faced by gay men, so apparently it makes no sense to have them grouped together, so they decided to start their own project, which you do realize that you can work on issues specific to your needs without ousting yourself from the community entirely. You don't need to go out of your way to form another group. The L in LGBT literally stands for lesbians. I mean, at this point, who are you forming alliance with? It's just one group that's left. But this is literally how fascism works, as I said before. The moment you start defining yourself with what you're not versus what you are, and start narrowing and dividing up the community, it very quickly goes downhill. You started off by claiming, oh no, we're just against trans ideology, we just don't want trans people in the community, and now look at where we are. Even though dividing up the community is the last thing that we need during such dire times. Because when you are divided up and are too busy fighting amongst each other, it makes you easier to conquer and forget who the real enemies are. So I have been finishing up this script about a week after Kelly J. Keane Minshall, otherwise known as her alias Percy Parker, held anti-trans rallies titled Let Women Speak all across Australia and New Zealand. For those who are out of the loop, Kelly J is a gender-critical feminist, which is code for trans exclusionary feminism, where transphobia is defended and justified through a thin layer of feminism. What you are seeing right now are the counter-protests to her rallies. In all of the rallies she showed up, the counter-protests to her rally outnumbered her by an at least 2-to-1 ratio. In Auckland, New Zealand, over 1,000 people showed up to protest her, to the point she was barely able to get a word in. She had tomato soup thrown at her, and the protest got so violent that she had to be escorted out of the country, cancelling her next rally in Wellington. The supposed rally in Wellington was then turned into a pride parade, showing solidarity and support for the trans and the LGBT+ community as a whole. I bring this up because I think it's fitting to end a video of LGBT community infighting and going against each other with instances where the community comes together to fight against the system, showing the magnitude of things that we can achieve when we are united. Because I went through a whole roller coaster of emotions while writing up this video. Obviously, when I first looked into organizations like the LGB Alliance and Gays Against Groomers, individuals like Dave Rubin and Blair White, I felt angry. I felt betrayed at all the things that they have said and done and everything that they stood for. Then I saw how even after desperately trying to fit in and gain the approval of these people, they are treated as mere mouthpieces for their hateful movement, only to be chewed up and spat out. I almost started to feel bad for them, almost, and then it hit me. I used to be like that too, once back when I was younger, still trying to figure myself out and come to terms with my identity. Being queer is hard. Being queer in a society that is still relatively cis-heteronormative, in a world that isn't ready for queerness and oftentimes actively rejects it and seems to be moving backwards, is hard. Most of us just want to be seen as regular everyday people, and the LGBT+ community is not perfect by any means, like I said before, and many of us have turned to the side of the opposition after being rejected by our own community. I'm not saying all this to defend and justify the actions of people like Dave and Blair or organizations like the LGB Alliance. In fact, I'm not even here to tell anybody that they deserve forgiveness on the occasion if they choose to change their minds, because at the end of the day, people like Dave and Blair made a choice. They chose to side with the oppressor, even though that meant throwing their own community under the bus. And, you know, it has worked out for them for the most part. They're definitely doing way better than your average gay or trans person. But what I know is this: no matter how many followers they get, how much money they make, or even in the rare occasion when they do gain the approval of transphobes and homophobes, nothing is going to come close to the solidarity and support the LGBT+ community can provide when we are united. Because when we come together, fight against the same cause, nothing can stop us. Blair and Dave would probably never know what it's like to have the genuine support of thousands of people that love and accept you unconditionally without having to pander or put on a facade. And while that is depressing, you can't save everyone. So maybe you shouldn't.
Earlier, we showed a clip about a young man dealing with transracial identity.
The black community, they just aren't accepting of racial diversity or anyone different for that matter.
Now, Harrison, would you say that the rap game or the hip-hop community is especially intolerant of the lifestyle you chose?
We really can't blame rap or the hip-hop culture. He's just expressing himself to the best of his ability, and I will defend his right to do that. He's telling a story or like views from the streets, you know, like a ghetto news.
Okay.
But Harrison, don't you think that the rap community and its treatment of trans people and homosexuals is indicative of a larger problem in the black community? One that makes your lifestyle unacceptable?
No way, not at all. I mean, a man wanting to turn himself into a woman, that's just unnatural, and I don't think we should have our kids thinking that that's okay. So I will support that message.
Wait, what are you saying?
I'm not into gay marriage. That is gross. Why would I ever tolerate something like that? The marriage is meant for a man and a woman, not that. That's an abomination. We no.
How can you say that with the discrimination you were just talking about? I mean,
It's the truth.
Are you crazy?
Crazy.
That is all the time we have today.